morning, everyone, and welcome to the CBI at 10. It's the last full working week of December, that week when you kind of think you're going to be gorging on mince pies and doing Christmas shopping, and nothing could be further from the truth in the UK in 2020. It feels as though we have as full a working week ahead of us as we've had all year. We obviously have a good deal on Brexit to discuss, and Tony Danker, the CBI's Director General, is here to talk about that. Brexit has obviously also made changes to our plans this morning. We're really grateful to the Minister of State, Minister for Housing, Chris Pincher, for joining us. Robert Jenrick, who was going to be here, is in a cabinet meeting discussing Brexit. So, Chris, thank you very much for making the time to be here. Our planned focus was levelling up, arguably the biggest agenda item for the UK and for this government. Sometimes the news, as I know, gets in the way of our plans, and so we're going to try and do two things this morning. We're going to hear, if we might, starting with you, Minister, a little bit about the government's plans on levelling up and a discussion on that. We're going to get some time, I hope, with Tony to talk about what we're hearing on Brexit, or what the CBI is hearing on Brexit. And then we're really fortunate that Rob Haley, who runs public affairs at Lloyd's and has been really wrapping his head around this levelling up agenda, and Hannah Richmond, who's the CBI policy director, has also been thinking about this a good deal, is joining us too. So it's a bit like Game of Thrones this morning. The plot lines do all intersect, but they don't necessarily all run consecutively. Tony, do you want to just sort of kick off just by giving us sort of the business framework for this levelling up agenda, and then I'm going to come to Chris Pincher, if I might.
Sure. Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks, Rob, for joining us from Lloyd's, joining Hannah. I know you'll talk about your work together shortly. And Minister, really delighted to have you here. Levelling up is a huge priority for all of us at the CBI, because it's a huge priority for the country. On my recent listening tour, I spent quite a lot of time talking to members in the regions and mayors in the regions about levelling up. And we've known for a long time that I think 9 out of 10 of the top UK cities were performing below the European average in productivity terms. And we know that government has been trying to do its bit in terms of changes to the Green Book to incentivize investment outside the Southeast, to certainly level up the infrastructure and transport investment around the country. But one of the things I've been talking to mayors a lot about has been, what does that mean for the business sector in local economies? How can we get more dynamism, more sector mix, more productive sectors in the regions? And a lot of what they've been discussing, which I thought was really interesting, is the idea of having internationally competitive regions. So you can level up public investment, and I'm sure the Minister will tell us what's the latest and greatest on that. But how do you get genuinely internationally competitive regions, which is, yes, about some of those macro factors like infrastructure, skills, and so on, but it's also about the dynamism of the business sector and comparative advantage too. So leveling up is one of those things you only achieve if you've got government and business working in tandem, nationally and locally. And so that's all I wanted to say by way of setting up. I think the government are on the right agenda here. I think it needs more than some of the things they can do. It needs business to play a part, but they, as ever, play a fundamental role in shaping the conditions for success. So over to you to pick that up with our guest.
Thank you very much. And Minister, will you start? I think a lot of people will share your analysis and the government's analysis of the problem. The question is, how do you then turn from a slogan to a set of outcomes? So do you want to talk about, in that sense, what the government's plan is?
Yes, James, thanks very much for inviting me to join you today. And thanks to Tony for laying out so very clearly the CBI's focus and commitment to levelling up. And congratulations, Tony, on your new role. And I hope that your dinner last Thursday went well. I'm sure it didn't involve mince pies. They are still to come for all of us in a week or so's time. We've had another extraordinary week, haven't we? This week with some good news, in the sense that the vaccine is now rolling out around our country, and we look forward to more of that in the new year. And so I think that although serious challenges still remain for us, we can be optimistic that 2021 will be the levelling up year for the United Kingdom, when we can kick off our programme. And as trailblazing resourceful, resilient businesses and entrepreneurs, it's your members who are going to be at the forefront of that recovery and of our levelling up agenda. Perhaps if I can say a few things, first of all, about what we have done before moving on to what we are going to do. As Tony alluded to, the pandemic has meant that we have backed the efforts of businesses to get through the shock of what happened in March and continues to happen, with one of the biggest economic support packages in the world. And it's protected jobs, it's supported incomes, and it's helped many businesses, large and small, to stay afloat. And one of the things that we were particularly keen to do, Robert Jenrick and I, was to ensure that during the last round of national restrictions, the housing market and the housing sector, which we reopened on the 12th of May, remained open. It is hugely important to us. It employs something like 1.1 million people throughout the supply chain, and it's remained remarkably robust given the early expectations in the early part of the epidemic. So we've tried to ensure that businesses have the adaptability and the flexibility to survive. Last week we extended the ban on commercial landlords evicting tenants until spring next year, until March next year. We've brought forward, as part of our Getting Building project, £900 million of investment for shovel-ready projects, and we have provided tools to replace some shops and offices with housing to build much more mixed communities. One of the other things that we were particularly keen during the pandemic was to make sure that shops are temporarily able to extend their opening hours, and they're now able to do that until January. And particularly in the hard-pressed hospitality sector, we've allowed pubs to open for takeaway and delivery services, and also use outdoor spaces more effectively. So we've tried to make sure that businesses have got tools to use during the pandemic, and we built therefore a strong foundation as we look beyond COVID-19. Now, the Prime Minister has spoken on a number of occasions, so has the Chancellor, and we have ambitious plans to deliver on the objective of reducing long-standing regional disparities in opportunity and productivity, and build a really competitive, dynamic world economy, as you've asked us to do and have identified the challenge in your Reviving Regions report. And the 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution that will not only advance our progress to net zero by 2050, but will also create thousands of high quality jobs in the Midlands and the North. And I'm a Midlands MP, I know the Midlands well, I'm very keen on that, is key to part of that objective. The creation of at least 10 free ports spread across our country will attract, we believe, investment and jobs in some of the most deprived parts of our country. And the spending review that the Chancellor undertook at the end of the month, you yourselves called, I think, I've got it written here, it lays the foundations for a brighter economic future. And we agree with that. We also want to ensure that the United Kingdom benefits from a UK shared prosperity fund. So all of us across our four nations benefit, and with funding pilots to prepare for its introduction, and with the acceleration of 4 city and growth deals in Scotland, we are making that happen. But I think the biggest, most striking announcement to support our levelling up agenda was the once-in-a-generation £100 billion investment in infrastructure for those places that have seen far too little of it over many, many decades. My part of the world, is one of those places. That commitment amounts to something like £20 billion for new homes, including just over £12 billion in our new affordable homes programme. That's the biggest affordable homes programme cash injection since the 2006 cycle. And more of that will be built outside London and outside the southeast, pushing much more investment, much more infrastructure into the Midlands and the north, levelling up. And that's why we've also introduced, it does what it says on the tin, a new £4 billion levelling up fund. That builds on the success of the Towns Fund, and it will take a place-based and holistic approach to funding for everyday architecture and infrastructure, the sorts of things that people tell us they want: vibrant high streets, upgraded.
Chris, forgive me just for interrupting, because I'm aware that you're going to have to go in 5 minutes. I just want to make sure, one of the great things about these CBI calls has been the exchange of views, particularly from CBI members. And there, as you were speaking, there were a couple of points that came in. I wanted to, one was just to register something with you, which not necessarily needs a response, but I think it's a point worth making, which is a member, Carl Tucker, writes in that says, can the Minister confirm that levelling up will not simply be seen as the North Midlands versus London and the South East? There are many other areas of the country that require levelling up investment, including the South West, where we also need of levelling up investment, and in return we can contribute significantly to economic growth and particularly to the low carbon economy. So I just wanted to register that point. And there was one point I just also wanted to make, which is, I think that people are really aware of the levelling up agenda around infrastructure, as you said, that, you know, the previous Chancellor and this one have both carried that forward. What feels as though there is a real question in 2020 in the light of the pandemic is digital skills, how the skills investment plan intersects with levelling up, and also how to make sure that the levelling up agenda is not top down, but is bottom up. It's coordinated between businesses and LEPs and those organisations that can harness local business sense and innovation. I wonder just whether you touch on that, given the constraints on time.
Fine. Well, you're absolutely right. Levelling up doesn't just mean the Midlands and the North. In a housing context, there is a focus on that because of the brownfield opportunities and because of the relative failure in over many years to improve the housing stock in those places. But there are places, as you say, in the southwest. There are parts of East Anglia, parts of the Essex coastline, which are left behind areas, and we need to make sure that we are focusing on them as well. So levelling up, although it's shorthand for the Midlands and the North, has a much longer title, which involves levelling up around the country in those places which have been left behind and need either the new homes and or the new jobs and the infrastructure to support those communities. With respect to dealing with the new economy, if you will, let me give you an example of where we are focusing, and it's particularly of interest to me. MMC, I think that we can build a world-class modern methods of construction supply chain in our country, which will support the development of homes which are much quicker to build, which means that bricklayers and carpenters and interior fitters can get it around them or into them more quickly. So you build more skills in that space as well as in the MMC factories. But you build homes which are quicker to erect, have fewer defects in them, and which are much greener. And you benefit parts of the country that haven't been touched by that kind of industry before. So we're putting our backs into MMC through the Affordable Homes Programme. The Treasury, usefully and importantly, is behind MMC as well. And that's an example of the way we're trying to make sure that we innovate to create the sorts of jobs that the future will require. We work closely with BEIS as well, who are the primary ministry focused on new jobs and new apprenticeships.
Because I'm aware of the pressures on time and that you have to disappear. Tony, do you want to just weigh in response to that? Just particularly, I suppose, the thing that's on my mind is this point that we've heard a good deal in the course of the year about how do we grow the levelling up agenda from the bottom up? How do we coordinate businesses with, you know, with local government as well as with central government?
Yeah, well, I think the minister was starting to lean in a bit at the end there into, I think, the thing most on business mind, which is, you know, I think that infrastructure investment has a huge long-term return. But there's a real desire, and probably particularly after COVID, because of some of the parts of the country that have been hit most, about how can we really accelerate dynamic business sector and economic activity quickly. And I don't know if the minister wants to speak to that, but I think that's what I'm hearing a lot about, which is particularly in these places of the country that have got some good long-term prospects coming from the net investment from government. But actually, the business sector is very often highly reliant on sectors hit hard by COVID, such as, you know, construction, hospitality, retail. That's where a lot of the jobs are. How can we get those places moving really quickly? I don't know if the minister's got some thoughts about that, but I think that's going to be one of the issues also in reviving regions that we've raised.
Well, it's a fair point, Tony. I mean, I was just touching on the Levelling Up Fund and agenda, where we are going to offer up to £20 billion for local projects. So local authorities, local MPs will be able to get involved with local businesses as well to identify shovel-ready projects which can benefit from those £20 million tranches of cash. So significant amounts of money locally, but small packages if you spread them around the country. That builds on the brownfield regeneration that we've been undertaking, and the Chancellor announced the £400 million brownfield regeneration fund. And the budget we're about to make, I mean, literally about to make some further announcements on that for some of our major cities in the next day or two, which will channel a great deal of cash into those places, supporting the elected mayors there, supporting local businesses to regenerate. And if you think about what construction entails in its end-to-end supply chain, you are talking about billions and billions worth of funding generated and unlocked. You're talking about millions of people who are employed. So focusing on that particular sector, I think, is going to be a vital consideration for the government.
Minister of Housing, Christopher Pincher, thank you. I know that you have to go, and I know you had to go 5 minutes ago, so we've imposed enough on your time. But thank you for joining us. I hope we can do this again in the new year, because it seems as though, just to judge from the questions that are coming in, there's so much interest in housing standards, construction standards, future funding. So let's see if we can get together again.
James, now I understand your format. Why don't we do it next time? It will be a proper Q&A. So rather than me making a speech at you, I will answer questions from you.
Both are good. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Okay.
Thanks.
Tony, I'm going to make some pretense at coherence here. So what I'm going to do, if you're right, is actually stick with Rob and Hannah and talk through in response what they're seeing in terms of levelling up, and then come in the last 10-15 minutes to you on Brexit, if that's all right.
Makes sense.
Hannah and Rob, I know in different ways you've both been thinking about this. I'm struck, Tony put it very diplomatically, I'm struck that there's a gulf in thinking about roads and railways and then the rewiring of the economy that does deliver a levelling up. Hannah, if I might, I'm going to start with you. What do you think in policy terms, if you're given the blank piece of A3 paper, if you like, to write strategy on levelling up, what should be on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I mean, I'm pleased it's an A3 piece of paper because it's quite a big conversation. But I think what's needed first is very much this sort of long-term strategic approach. You know, the policy making around levelling up has been quite chop and change. Things haven't been allowed to embed very well before they're changed again. So definitely first, when we start, it's long-term strategic approach. Then we know that this is a productivity issue. So interventions need to think about drivers of productivity. So we identified them in some work we did a couple of years ago as sort of education and skills, connectivity, innovation, business management, opportunities around exporting. So it's thinking about how can we address those things for the business community? But then we've got this added complication of things like COVID, of Brexit, of AI and automation, which were all the things we identified within our Reviving Regions report. But I think, you know, when we look at the fact that we have this overwhelming health crisis, investing in drivers and productivity is just one side of the coin. We need to address those social challenges around health and education, deprivation. So, you know, it's always very exciting to talk about, you know, large pots of funding to go towards infrastructure. But until we address those other elements, the social elements, then we're not really going to achieve levelling up, because for us, we take it to mean not just closing the productivity gaps, but also the equality gaps. Layered on top of that is this idea of what the new normal looks like. We've touched on it, but we know COVID is going to change the way we work. Businesses are working out what that means for the future. It might mean more flexible working. It might mean changes to the way we use our towns and cities, our office spaces, public transport, and that could have implications for the recovery and therefore on the levelling up agenda. A lot of our productivity growth has traditionally come from city centres, so how we use them in the future will have implications for where we invest these sort of new funds to drive levelling up and productivity growth.
Just Hannah, the productivity gap, equality gap point is a massively important public policy point. Is the evidence that where you do improve productivity, that does have an impact on the equality gap, or is there not necessarily a link there?
So when we did our original research, our argument was very much that driving productivity growth improves living standards, improves, you know, money in people's pockets, improves wages. So there is a link there, but I think increasingly it's felt that needs to be more targeted. You know, we need to be making sure that the opportunities are there that match people's aspirations. There's this idea that we need to raise aspirations, and I just don't think that's true. People have aspirations, they just don't have the opportunities to meet them. We hear time and time again, businesses across the country struggling to access talent across the regions because there aren't the job opportunities in different parts of the country, so people have to move south for those. So, you know, there is a definite need to make sure that when we are thinking about productivity, it really is money in people's pockets through improved, you know, wages and living standards. And that's where part of our argument around the sort of need for a more local approach comes in. So we really feel this sort of bottom-up, place-based approach is key, because it means that you have these local challenges and you're dealing with it through more local solutions. And again, that really has an impact on the lives of the people in those communities.
And thanks. I just want to, Rob, bring you in. I know that you've done a lot of work, and Lloyd's done a lot of work on this, and hats off to you on it. I suppose the thing that's you really want to know is distilled. What have you learned?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you, James, and I'd just like to say thank you to the CBI for the important work that they've done on the Reviving Regions report. You know, we're very pleased to support them on it. You know, we obviously as a bank have a very much of a UK focus as a retail and commercial bank, so we have that sort of vested interest in finding ways to help Britain prosper. So really pleased to work with the CBI on that. I think, turning to your question, thinking about how we support the levelling up agenda, we've talked about productivity as being a key challenge, and we've worked closely with Tony in a previous life when he was at Be the Business, obviously trying to engage our business customers and getting them to think about actually some of the investments that they could make in improving their own productivity. So we think that's a really key part of this. And then if I think about what could happen next and what the experience has been through the pandemic, actually one of the fascinating things for me is that we've seen for many of the customers who've taken on additional debt through the government loan schemes, this is actually their first experience with debt as a business. So I think the fascinating thing will be to see, you know, if we can help them get through this troubling period ahead and through the pandemic and the you know, the economic situation that we now face. Actually, will they then be more familiar with taking on external finance and prepared to do it? And then they're in a position that potentially they can invest in those productivity gains, which will drive the levelling up agenda. So I think that's my first point around sort of familiarity with debt. I think the second one that we've sort of unearthed is about access to advice and support. And obviously they can come to their bank or other financial provider, and there are other existing sources of advice, but they're not necessarily joined up or might not know, businesses might not know where to go to find them. So I think that's one of the things we've heard in our conversations around this, is actually how do you join up those sources of advice, because now more than ever businesses need it. And then I know you're trying to come in, but my final point would be, I think what we heard about was the need for certainty. And obviously the economic and political situation at the moment is very uncertain. And certainly even prior to the pandemic, there was various surveys that sort of showed that was the sort of primary thing holding back the business community in terms of their willingness to invest. Because at the end of the day, investment is a long-term decision, and you need to know that there's certainty about the environment that you're looking into in the years ahead.
No, Rob, I was only coming in because I guess I'm concerned that we're all tired at the end of the year, and the enthusiasm for learning, which was one of the features of this thing in the first few months, has slightly waned. And your point about debt is really interesting. There's such a big debate about public debt, but it feels to me as though next year we're really going to be getting our arms around private debt, individual and corporate. And I wondered whether you can begin to map where that debt lies, who's most exposed to it, so that we can go into 2021 thinking not just about leveling up, but responding to the issues of borrowing.
Perhaps it's worth me talking a bit about the sort of support that banks like us have provided through the pandemic. Obviously, recognise this has been a very difficult period. And actually, one of the things we found was that many of our business customers didn't want to take on that significant additional debt. So the ways we could then help them were thinking about their sort of working capital needs. So things like offering capital repayment holidays, so reducing the sort of monthly outgoings that businesses face on a temporary basis. And similarly, increasing or offering an overdraft facility. So just providing that extra bit of breathing space in terms of working capital. So that was sort of one of our significant ways of helping. In terms of your question about debt, I mean, I've mentioned the government loan schemes. We had the bounce back scheme, which was obviously a significant part of that. That combined with the CBIL scheme, or coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, we as Lloyds have lent out over 11 billion through those schemes to 300,000 customers. So huge, widespread take up of these schemes. And I think as an industry as a whole, these schemes have lent out close to 65 billion now. So there's a significant additional debt out there in the economy. And obviously at some point that needs to get repaid back. And the industry has been working to kind of work with the government collaboratively on how you do that. But obviously I think the collective effort has really made a difference. And hopefully we're showing as an industry that we want to be part of the solution to this challenge that we're all facing.
Rob, thank you. Tony, can I just come to you, and maybe this one for you and Hannah, really, which is, there's a risk, I think, for the CBI and for business more broadly around the levelling up agenda, which is sort of, in shorthand, I'd describe as give me a break, right? Which is, we've heard this for years and years. People old enough to remember Heseltine heard it. They heard it from Gordon Brown. Here's another version of this. And as Rob was just suggesting, there are real world issues in debt, right? There are real world issues, as Hannah was just suggesting, around COVID and different experiences of tiering, which are adding to, political frustrations. And then it's really hard to see when you're making long-term infrastructure bets on anything really feeding through in any meaningful way in even the next 12 to 24 month window. So how does a business organization weigh in and say, look, we are doing something that is materially going to impact this in a way that people are going to see that's going to have a tangible impact?
Well, Hannah may add to this. Look, I think there's a big economic question on levelling up, and I think there's a big political question. The minister got out of dodge before we could get into it. But the big economic question, for me, talking to the mayors and talking to some of our members, is around, as I said at the beginning, real competitiveness on an international scale. And we've never really been serious about that as a country when it comes to our regions. That's why we fall behind the Germans. It's why we fall behind the Americans, because we really are, dominated by this corner of the world here in the southeast. And when you talk to the mayors and local regions, they're very excited about comparative advantage internationally. So in Liverpool, they talk constantly about tidal. In the Northeast, they talk about offshore wind. In the West Midlands, they talk about being an advanced manufacturing hub for the world. And all I can say is my pledge and our pledge is that as we start to build this economic vision piece that I've talked about before, that will be at the heart of it. Genuine regional international competitiveness is critical. And to Rob and Hannah's point about investment, unlocking investment locally, joint alignment locally to investing in what's really going to create good high value jobs in this part of the world has to be a part of policy going forward. It's why the CBI has done 2 reports on this in the last few years. I think there is a political point.
Tony,
Yeah.
sorry, just interrupt you 1 second. Just because someone called Nigel Dowell has written in just absolutely on this point, which is to say the idea of internationally competitive regions is smart. It works in other countries. His question is the UK well placed to adopt international productivity improvement?
I think so. And I think it does link a little bit to the political point. We've seen there's been a subplot in the last 6 months. We saw it with the standoff with Manchester around real localism in this country. And when you talk to the mayors about this agenda, what they really want is they don't want a levelling up fund that they can apply for. They want a genuine devolution of the money over a long-term period so that they can sit with local business leaders and develop genuine 5-year plans for the economy, including the kinds of investments that I think was Roger, your questioner, is alluding to.
Nigel, yeah.
Nigel. And I think that's the really interesting piece. And that is the wrestle for control I think you still have from central government to local government. And I think that from talking to our regional chairs who all have good relationships with their members, and I'm sure Hannah knows them very well, she's based up in the Yorkshire area, that idea of joint aligned long-term local economic strategy is the goal. I think that is absolutely right to take this agenda forward. And as yet, I think there's still a political tension between whether or not we genuinely give away money and power to local communities to develop those locally, internationally competitive strategies. We're not quite there yet.
Hannah, do you want to follow up on that? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, Tony's very much stolen my thunder there, because that is exactly what businesses are asking for. Like when I look back to the consultation we did as part of this report, I think the biggest bit of feedback was it's so complicated. Trying to understand what's causing these productivity differences, trying to understand and navigate the different layers of local and regional government, the different streams of business support, understanding, the different criteria even within different Whitehall departments for funding. It's an incredibly complicated system, and so and real frustration that it isn't getting better at pace. And the reason we see this local sort of devolution approach as being one of the sort of major things that needs to change is also the fact that these challenges are so multifaceted. So when you look at things like education deprivation, so perhaps just taking it slightly further back and moving away from this sort of north-south divide point that people often come down on, education and health deprivation is spread across the entire country. You have it in former industrialized towns in the North and Midlands, but you also have really high rates of things like education deprivation in the sort of the southwest and the east of England and in coastal towns. So this isn't a north-south conversation, but it's about empowering places across the country, and as Tony said, to really focus in on those international strengths that the areas have. But as I say, these challenges are multifaceted. You can't look at education deprivation without thinking about things like housing. Do children have a quiet space that they can focus in on their work? Do they have access to a laptop and to the internet to allow them to connect in with homeschooling at the moment? These challenges aren't just education, housing, infrastructure. They have to be seen as aligned, and this is what one of the benefits of a place-based approach is, and this is really what the devolved authorities and the mayors are pushing for, is this idea that you would have a vision, a strategy for your region that is place-based, that recognises the challenges that your local area faces, that builds on things like the local industrial strategies, which were developed and haven't been published, but identified place-based strengths and solutions. And that you would agree a set of objectives with government. So instead of being siloed to each department, you would agree your vision for your region, your international competitive angle, what outcomes you want to achieve, and then you would get on and deliver it. But you would have the resources, the funding necessary to do that. And it moves away from being quite so siloed, which is really part of getting this right.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's interesting, I mean, it's really interesting, you talk, Tony, about your listening tour. I know one of the things that Lloyd's has done, I don't know whether this is your part of it, Rob, but this big conversation with business that means that people listen to businesses. I'm going to do something rude, I'm afraid. Apologies, Hannah and Rob. It feels as though we've got so much to get stuck into, and I know that your Reviving Regions report is actually on the CBI website. I do encourage everyone to go and have a good read of it, because you can actually get into the weeds of it there. But forgive me, it feels really odd, Tony, not to just try and dig into where we are on Brexit. So can we start with, like, where do you think we are? What do you think is actually happening?
Well, I noticed yesterday that Simon Coveney admitted, as the Irish Foreign Minister, he didn't really know what was going on. So I'm not going to try and outdo Simon and pretend that I know what's going on. We're all reading this from the outside in. And whilst I've been talking to Downing Street, Treasury, Bays all over the weekend, this is a pretty tight-knit conversation. But what I think seems to be going on, and this is why I think it's quite heartening, is I think they've moved away from regarding divergence as a very binary conversation, where actually we need it to be dynamic, we don't need it to be, and they're talking about dispute resolution. They've recognized, I think, that they can't anticipate all the hypothetical ways in which economies might diverge. And so they're starting to focus on a much more believable, credible dispute resolution mechanism for should these situations arise. Again, I think I've said it to you before, James, as business people, we are so used to this. If you're ever negotiating a deal around a table, if you start to think about all the things that go wrong, it's very tempting to walk away. That happens in every deal. And so the only thing you can ever do is come up with a way that we are going to resolve unforeseen disputes. And I think if that's where the conversation is, I cannot believe we can't find a way to come up with a pretty fair, pretty independent, pretty objective, evidence-driven way to resolve arising disputes on divergence.
And then let's assume that this plays out. Let's assume for a moment that there are two tracks here, aren't there? There's one which is, victory from the jaws of defeat, and at the last moment something happens, or we strained every sinew but we couldn't make it work, right? Let's assume that we're at the victory from the jaws of defeat route here. One question is that there's going to be so much now contingency planning for no deal, but that itself will have an impact over the next couple of weeks for businesses. What are you advising both to government and businesses in the handling of the uncertainty that's going to flow for the coming days?
Yeah, look, the stark reality, which is not particularly good news for anyone, is that we really want them to keep going. It's really worth it, right? If you are a sector exposed to tariffs, automotive, farming, manufacturing, SME exporters, 80% of which, by the way, go to Europe, tariffs cut you off at the knees. So you have to have government keep going. The problem is, of course, is that the closer you get to 31st of December, the risk gets bigger. I've always said that, if you don't have goodwill in this process, that's the risk for a pretty cold New Year's Day. And if you've got goodwill, you get to the kinds of facilitations we've been talking about. Grace periods on relabeling, you start to solve the data adequacy problem. The Europeans just say, yep, your data holding is good enough. Professional services firms have got contracts, yep, those go. And if there's goodwill in this negotiation and you get a deal, I'm pretty confident that all that stuff gets dealt with really quickly. Everybody agrees as part of the deal, no cliff edge. Let's smooth this out. The big risk is if we keep going and actually there's no deal and there's some bad will and it's late in the day, all the cliff edge smoothing doesn't get done. In fact, there's a standoff. And that's the point at which you get, the ports and the roads all backed up because customs officials are being pretty stringent. It's where people don't really start to do business with each other. It's where firms become unwittingly illegal in their actions.
Yeah.
So I'll be honest with you, it's a pretty tough time, because everybody from government to us is saying we need more detail before we can give more guidance. In as much as there can be some pragmatism. So the Europeans last week made some allowances around aviation and haulage. Both sides got there with a little bit more detail on Northern Ireland. That stuff is golden. And if we can, we'll get as much of that as we can out of both sides. But this could go down to the wire, I'm afraid.
And Tony, what is one of the concerns I've got is that we inevitably, I mean, it's been a year for being very parochial, being where we are, but in this debate too, we're very focused on what the Johnson government is doing, and it's hard to read what the Europeans are thinking. I'm wondering, your counterparts in the business organizations across Europe, are they agitated? Have they packed up for Christmas? Do you get any read from them on whether or not the mood is hardening against a deal amongst the Europeans?
Well, not amongst the European business organizations. So we released a joint statement with Business Europe this weekend. I'm speaking to their Director General, Marcus, later this evening. I think businesses on both sides of the channel are very focused on these pragmatic issues. We're deeply concerned about cliff edge. We're deeply concerned about, slightly political posturing when it comes to these facilitations, when it comes to grace periods and recognizing data, because we trade with each other. So actually, no, this is less, us v them. It's a bit more, business are pretty united in keeping trade flowing. A deal is worth going for, and in any event, we need to keep trade flowing. But look, we're all on the outside in of a political process that a lot of it is about trust, as well as the very practical finding that little answer about dispute resolution that hopefully opens up the deal. So I think that's where it is with our European business colleagues.
And can I just ask you one other question, which is probably a very, very big picture question, which may seem out of step with the moment. If it is no deal, if it is we strained every sinew but we didn't get a deal, it strikes me there's a different ask then of business and the CBI, which is we're on WTO terms, but we have a range of freedoms in terms of new regulations, new forms of state investment. And I suppose the ask of you, Tony, and of the CBI would be, well, now what do you want to do in terms of the government's relationship with business that creates a different environment that improves competitiveness? And I wonder how much you and the CBI have begun to think about that.
Yeah, it's a very good question, James. Look, I think, as I've said to you before, we're going to do a piece of vision work at the start of the year about how Britain competes in the world. And therefore, you are right in one sense that we're going to look for business and government to unite around a vision that's very British, that really leverages our competitive advantage and so on. The risk with what you're implying is that should we do too much now to try and exploit no deal freedoms, the risk is we don't end up coming back to the table. And so I think one of the things to watch for is if we don't get there by the end of the year, are we really saying that's it forever? Or are we going to want to get back to the table in the new year with the Europeans and hopefully find a way forward? So I think it might be a bit early to start diverging and over-investing in a way that's out of the spirit of the alignment we're trying to find with the European Union. But I do think it is absolutely the time in the new year, deal or no deal, to work out Britain's future competitiveness. Hopefully we can square that circle.
And just and given that everyone is conspiring to ruin Christmas, can I just ask you personally, Tony, how are you thinking about what's going to happen? Do you think this is, if we get a deal, it's the 23rd of December, or do you think it even runs to the 30th?
Well, I have no idea is the truthful answer, but I think that I think there's going to be a lot happens, even if we got a deal early, or even if there was a no deal declared for now early. I think the ensuing few days are big days for the CBI, because I think what we'll be doing is lobbying government to try and find accommodations with the European Union for these grace periods to smooth the cliff edge, trying to get guidance out to everybody about what exactly happens in the 1st of January so that we're not all in no man's land in legal terms. So I don't, it wouldn't surprise me if they went to the wire. It could be they announce something in the next 24 hours. Either way, I think what comes after a deal or no deal is this deeply pragmatic stuff about what happens at the 1st of January and what does it mean not only for those massively affected sectors that I talked about, but also for anybody that's got, travel booked to Europe or a contract to serve in Europe. We need to get those answers quickly. So yes, deal or no deal will come when it comes. then actually the work really begins.
Okay, well, Tony, thank you very much. Listening to you, I'm yearning for those days when we used to have debates at the end of the year, which were Christmas cards, a thing of the past, discuss. You know, it feels as though we've got really substantial things to go for this this week. We've got, as I think people know, CBI at 10 on Wednesday, where we're going to be looking at transition preparedness, you know, deal or no deal. And then we're back again on Friday. One of the themes of the year has been talking about mental health and the workplace. And so we're getting together on Friday for that. But I just want to say a big thank you to Rob Haley of Lloyd's and to and of course to Hannah too of the CBI. Likewise to you, Tony. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you on Wednesday at 10. Have a very good week.